Ambulance sirens wailed across the landing zone. Paramedics rushed between casualties, applying pressure, starting IVs, shouting updates over radio static. A woman with long brown hair and a simple shirt knelt beside a dying soldier. Nobody knew who she was until she cut away his body armor with surgical precision, pressed directly on his severed artery, and began issuing orders like she commanded the entire scene. A young paramedic froze mid-step and whispered, That's Delta's chief medic. Meet Sophia Adler, 33 years old, Austrian German heritage, with long brown hair and steady, compassionate eyes that had seen more trauma than most people could imagine. After more than a decade serving as chief tactical medic for Delta Force operations, Sophia had quietly left military service and moved to a small town, where she worked as a volunteer medical advisor at the community health clinic. The locals knew her simply as Sophia from the medical office. Nobody suspected she'd once commanded medical teams during the most classified special operations missions in modern military history. Sophia kept her past buried deep. She'd arrive at the clinic each morning in civilian clothes, organize medical supplies with methodical precision, and spend her own money buying extra antibiotics and trauma supplies for the understaffed facility. When the younger paramedics made jokes about her background, she'd just smile quietly. Sophia's been here so long, she probably only handles bicycle accidents. One would laugh during shift changes. I heard she's never even worked a real emergency scene, another would add. Sophia never corrected them. To her, medicine was medicine, whether practiced in a desert combat zone or a small town parking lot. Lives were lives, regardless of the uniform they wore or the circumstances that put them in danger. But there were subtle signs of her extraordinary background for those who knew what to look for. Her hands moved with surgical precision, even during routine checkups. She could assess trauma severity with a single glance. When treating minor injuries, she'd unconsciously follow triage protocols designed for mass casualty events. Most telling was her response time. No matter where Sophia was, when emergency calls came in, she'd appear at incident scenes faster than seemed possible, carrying medical supplies most civilian medics had never seen. The other medical staff attributed her efficiency to years of community service. They had no idea she was operating on muscle memory developed during the most intensive combat medical training in the world. Sophia preferred it that way. After losing too many soldiers despite her best efforts, she'd chosen anonymity over recognition. The weight of command decisions, where every second determined who lived or died, had finally become too much to bear. She'd hung up her military uniform and tried to forget the feeling of performing emergency surgery under enemy fire, or the sound of helicopters evacuating casualties she'd stabilize with her bare hands. But some skills never truly fade. They hibernate in muscle memory, waiting for circumstances that demand their resurrection. The afternoon everything changed started like any other. Sophia was restocking medical supplies when the emergency alert system activated. Multiple casualties reported near the military training facility. Vehicle accident involving 4 active duty soldiers during training exercises. As Sophia grabbed her emergency medical kit, something stirred deep inside her chest. The familiar weight of responsibility, the automatic mental shift from civilian healer to combat medic. She tried to push the feeling down. She wasn't chief medic anymore. She was just Sophia, community volunteer. But as she drove toward the accident scene, her hands were already mentally rehearsing trauma protocols she hadn't used in years. In Sophia's jacket pocket, she always carried a miniature, folded medical patch with faded hand lettering, 1 minute saves 3 lives, the motto of Delta Medical Unit. The scene was chaos. Multiple soldiers lay scattered across twisted metal and broken glass where their transport vehicle had rolled during a training exercise. One was unconscious with a penetrating chest wound, blood pooling at an alarming rate. The local paramedic team had arrived first, but they were struggling. The worst casualty was bleeding out, and they couldn't locate the primary source of hemorrhage through his tactical gear. Sophia parked her aging SUV and approached the scene. Her trained eyes immediately assessed the situation: multiple trauma victims, inadequate scene organization, and critical time loss due to procedural confusion. The youngest paramedic, Marcus, was attempting chest compressions on the unconscious soldier. His technique was textbook, correct for civilian emergencies, but completely wrong for this type of penetrating trauma. "Excuse me, ma'am, you need to stay back," called the team leader as Sophia approached. "This is an active emergency scene." Sophia didn't respond verbally. Instead, she knelt beside the dying soldier and began cutting away his body armor with surgical scissors that appeared in her hands as if by magic. Her movements were fluid, precise, and impossibly fast. Within seconds, she'd exposed the wound, identified the severed subclavian artery, and was applying direct pressure with expert hand placement. "Get me negative blood ready at the trauma center," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed during life or death situations. "Prepare chest seal materials. We're moving in 90 seconds. The paramedics stopped what they were doing and stared. Sophia's hands worked with mechanical precision. She established an IV line while maintaining pressure on the arterial bleed, checked pupil response, and calculated blood loss volume, all simultaneously. "Marcus, stabilize his cervical spine. Sarah, get the backboard ready. Tom, radio ahead with these vitals." She continued, calling each team member by name, though she'd never worked with them before. Her diagnostic accuracy was stunning. She identified a pneumothorax that the other medics had missed, detected early signs of shock that weren't yet showing on their monitors, and predicted exactly which trauma protocols the hospital would need to implement. "How does she know our names?" Marcus whispered to Sarah as they followed Sophia's rapid-fire instructions. "How does she know those procedures?" Sarah whispered back. "That's military trauma medicine, not civilian protocol." Sophia was completely absorbed in her work, operating on pure instinct, developed over thousands of hours treating combat casualties. Every movement was economic, every decision instantaneous, every technique drawn from experience, saving lives under the most extreme conditions imaginable. When the medical helicopter arrived, she had the patient completely stabilized, with 3 additional casualties triaged and ready for transport in order of severity. As the flight crew loaded the soldiers, one of the paramedics noticed something. Sophia's medical gloves bore a faded logo that made his blood run cold. Delta Force Medical Unit. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm and pointed. "Look at her gloves. Look at the way she works. That's not civilian medical training." The helicopter lifted off, carrying casualties who would have died without Sophia's intervention. She stood in the rotor wash, hair whipping around her face, watching the aircraft disappear toward the trauma center. "Ma'am," Marcus approached carefully, "I have to ask, what's your background? Those weren't standard civilian procedures." Sophia pulled off her gloves and looked at the young paramedic for a moment. Her carefully maintained anonymity hung in the balance. "I've had some military medical experience," she said quietly. "Some experience." Sarah had overheard. "Lady, I've worked with Army medics, Navy corpsmen, Air Force PJs. None of them work like that. That was special operations level trauma medicine." Sophia started walking toward her SUV, hoping to escape the questions. But Tom, the team leader, had been making phone calls. "Sophia Adler," he called out, reading from his phone screen. "Former Chief Combat Medic, Delta Force, 10 years of service, classified missions, distinguished service record." Sophia stopped walking. "The soldier you just saved?" Tom continued, still reading. "He's going to live. Because the best combat medic in special operations history happened to be volunteering at our little community clinic." The paramedic team gathered around Sophia, looking at her with expressions mixing awe, respect, and a dozen questions. Marcus spoke first. "Ma'am, why didn't you tell us? Why are you working at a community clinic when you could be training trauma surgeons?" Sophia looked at each of them, these dedicated medical professionals who risk their lives every day to save others. "Because rank, titles, and uniforms don't heal people," she said simply. "Skill and caring do. Today, what mattered wasn't who I used to be. What mattered was doing whatever it took to keep that soldier alive." In Sophia's wallet was an old military ID card, edges worn smooth from years of handling, with the title Chief Combat Medic, Delta Force. The questions wouldn't stop. Word had spread through the emergency medical community about the mysterious woman who'd saved 4 soldiers with techniques that bordered on miraculous. Sophia found herself in the hospital administrator's office the next morning facing Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the trauma center director, who'd received the casualties. "I need to understand what happened yesterday," Dr. Walsh said, pulling up surgical reports on her computer. "The soldier with the arterial bleed, according to our surgeons, should have been dead before he reached our facility. Your field stabilization was so precise that we barely had to adjust your work." Sophia sat quietly, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "Your IV placement was perfect, your pressure points were exact, and your triage decision saved all 4 lives. This wasn't luck, Sophia. This was elite-level trauma medicine." Dr. Walsh pulled up another file. "I made some calls last night. Colonel Martinez at Special Operations Command remembers you. He says you're the best combat medic Delta Force ever produced." The weight of her past settled back on Sophia's shoulders like familiar armor. "I served for 10 years, she admitted, Chief Medical Officer for Delta Operations worldwide. Counterterrorism, hostage rescue, deep reconnaissance missions. Places that don't appear on any maps. Treating wounds that couldn't be explained to families back home." Dr. Walsh leaned forward. "What made you leave?" Sophia stared at her hands, the same hands that had performed emergency surgery in desert bunkers, stabilized casualties while under enemy fire, and held dying soldiers who whispered their final words to someone they trusted completely. "Operation Desert Storm 2019. Sophia began slowly. Hostage rescue in Syria. Terrorists had taken a school. 43 children inside. Delta went in hard and fast." The memory played behind her eyes like a film she'd watched too many times. 7 of my men were hit in the first 30 seconds. The mission continued, but I had wounded operators scattered across 3 floors of a building while gunfire was still active. She paused, gathering strength to continue. "I spent 8 hours moving between casualties, performing surgery with bullets flying overhead, keeping my team alive while they completed the mission. All 7 soldiers survived. All 43 children were rescued. Dr. Walsh waited, sensing there was more to the story. But when we got home, when the medals were awarded and the classified reports were filed, I realized I'd been treating soldiers like medical puzzles to be solved, instead of human beings I cared about. Sophia's voice grew quieter. I'd become so focused on technical perfection that I'd forgotten these were my brothers bleeding out in front of me. The emotional numbness that helped me work under fire had started affecting my ability to connect with the people I was saving. So you left special operations to rediscover your humanity? I left because I was afraid of becoming a machine that healed bodies but couldn't feel the weight of the lives in my hands. Sophia looked directly at Dr. Walsh. Yesterday was the first time in 3 years I'd practiced trauma medicine at that level. When I saw that soldier bleeding out, everything came flooding back. Not just techniques, but the feeling of responsibility for someone's entire future. Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. And now? Now, I remember why I became a medic in the first place. Not for the recognition or the challenge, but because when someone is dying, nothing else matters except doing everything in your power to keep them alive. The doctor pulled out a formal document. The hospital board has authorized me to offer you a position as our emergency trauma coordinator, full salary, benefits, and the opportunity to train our staff in advanced life support techniques. Sophia read through the offer carefully. It was generous, professional recognition of her extraordinary skills. I appreciate this, but I don't need a title or a salary to do what I did yesterday. Then what do you need? Sophia thought for a moment. I need people to understand that medical excellence isn't about credentials or positions. It's about being prepared, both technically and emotionally, to be someone's last hope when everything goes wrong. Dr. Walsh studied Sophia's face. You know the paramedic team has been asking for additional training. They want to learn the techniques you used yesterday. They don't need to learn Delta Force protocols, Sophia replied. They need to learn to trust their training completely, make decisions without hesitation, and never forget that every person they treat is someone's entire world. Over the following days, Sophia found herself quietly mentoring the paramedic team, not through formal classes or official programs, but through shared experiences at emergency scenes. Marcus, the young paramedic who'd first noticed her techniques, became her unofficial student. How do you stay so calm? He asked during a particularly difficult call. Because panic has never saved a life, Sophia replied, demonstrating proper trauma assessment techniques. Fear is information. Use it to stay alert, but never let it control your hands. The local fire department commander approached Sophia about conducting training sessions for their rescue personnel. Word was spreading about the miracle medic who'd appeared from nowhere to save soldiers that other medics couldn't help. Sophia agreed, but on her terms. No publicity, no official recognition, just practical skills transfer that could save lives. During one training session, a firefighter asked, "Ma'am, what's the most important thing you learned in special operations?" Sophia considered the question carefully. That titles, uniforms, and recognition are just external things. What defines a medic is what happens in the critical moments when someone's life depends entirely on your knowledge, your skill, and your willingness to do whatever it takes. She looked around the room at these dedicated first responders. Yesterday, I wasn't chief medic of Delta Force. I was just someone who knew how to stop bleeding and had the courage to act. That's all any of us really are when it matters most. The room was silent as her words sank in. Every one of you has the potential to be someone's miracle, not because of your title or your agency, but because you've trained for the moment when ordinary people need extraordinary help. Type "I owe a debt" if you've ever been saved by someone you never expected. Sophia returned to her routine at the community clinic, but everything had changed, in ways both subtle and profound. The paramedic team that had witnessed her work now sought her opinion on difficult cases. When emergency calls came in, they'd instinctively look for her approval before implementing treatment plans. She tried to maintain her low profile, but respect had a way of spreading through the emergency services community like ripples in still water. During a monthly training meeting, Marcus asked a question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Sophia, how do you know when you're really ready to handle a critical situation?" Sophia looked around the room at these dedicated professionals who risk their lives daily for strangers. You're ready when you stop thinking about whether you're qualified and start focusing completely on what the person in front of you needs to survive. She moved to the whiteboard and drew a simple timeline. In trauma medicine, everything happens in seconds. There's no time for self-doubt, no time to wish you had more training or better equipment. There's only time to use everything you know to fight for someone's life. Sarah, one of the more experienced paramedics, raised her hand. "But what if you make a mistake?" "Then you make it while doing everything in your power to save a life," Sophia replied without hesitation. The only unforgivable mistake is hesitating when someone is dying because you're worried about being perfect. After the meeting, Sophia noticed something had appeared on the clinic bulletin board. Someone had printed and posted a photograph from the accident scene, showing her working on the wounded soldier. Below the image, someone had handwritten, "Chief Medic, no uniform required." Sophia stared at the photo for a long time. She'd spent 3 years trying to escape that identity, convinced that leaving special operations meant leaving behind the weight of command decisions and life or death responsibility. But looking at the image, she realized something important. She hadn't stopped being a chief medic when she left the military. She'd simply stopped wearing the title while continuing to embody everything it represented. Tom, the paramedic team leader, found her studying the photo. "You know, half our staff has been asking if you'd consider making this official. Emergency services coordinator or trauma training director, something with actual authority." Sophia shook her head. "Authority doesn't save lives. Knowledge and compassion do. I don't need anyone to follow my orders. I just need them to be prepared when someone needs help. But surely you miss the recognition, the sense of importance." Sophia turned away from the bulletin board. "The most important thing I ever did in the military happened yesterday in a civilian parking lot with no rank, no uniform, and no one keeping score. That soldier is alive because I remembered what I learned about stopping arterial bleeding, not because anyone saluted me." Over the following months, Sophia continued her quiet work at the community clinic. But now, when emergency calls came in, she responded, not as a former special operations medic trying to help, but as someone who had finally understood that titles and positions were just external decorations. What mattered was being prepared, both technically and emotionally, to be someone's last chance when everything went wrong. On the clinic's bulletin board, someone had added a second note below the photograph. "Skills don't retire. They just wait for the moment when they're needed most." Type "I will live right" if you believe that real skill doesn't need titles to save lives. Sophia didn't leave the military because she'd lost her abilities.
She left because her heart had absorbed too much loss, too many impossible decisions, too many nights wondering if she could have saved just one more. But when crisis struck, she responded exactly as she had during her first day in uniform. Because true skill isn't something you can abandon, it becomes part of who you are. This story reminds us that titles, rank, uniforms, and recognition don't define our capabilities. What defines us is how we respond when someone desperately needs our help. You might have left a career behind, moved on from a role that once defined your identity, or convinced yourself that your specialized knowledge isn't relevant to your current life. But skills, forged through dedication and tested under pressure, never truly disappear. They hibernate in muscle memory and professional instinct, waiting for the moment when someone's survival depends on what you know. Sophia's story teaches us that expertise isn't about the position you hold or the title on your business card. It's about being prepared, both technically and emotionally, to be someone's miracle when their world falls apart. The most profound acts of service often happen when no one is keeping score, when there's no recognition to be gained, when helping someone is simply the right thing to do. Maybe you've convinced yourself that your specialized training isn't needed in your current environment. Maybe you think your hard-earned expertise isn't relevant to the everyday challenges you face now. But somewhere, someone will need exactly what you know how to do. They won't care about your job title or your official credentials. They'll only care that you have the knowledge and the courage to act when their life depends on it. Sophia spent 3 years trying to bury her identity as Delta Force's chief medic, but when that soldier was bleeding out in a parking lot, she discovered that her true identity wasn't determined by military rank or special operations assignments. Her identity was determined by her willingness to use everything she'd learned to fight for someone's life, regardless of the circumstances or the recognition. If you've ever quietly used your expertise to help someone with no expectation of recognition, if you've ever stepped up in a crisis because you were the only one present with the necessary skills, if you believe that real capability doesn't need official authorization to make a difference, this is your story. The brass patch in Sophia's pocket reminds her daily, 1 minute saves 3 lives. Not because she's officially authorized to save them, but because she's prepared to do whatever it takes when someone's entire future depends on what she does next. If you believe in stories that touch the hearts, like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to Iron Heart Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.